Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Roberts. I'm the Research Director for the Energy Technologies Program in CSIRO's Energy Business Unit, and thanks for the opportunity to present virtually via recording at this H2 Meet event. I'm coming to you from CSIRO's site in Brisbane, in Australia, the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And yes, I'm talking today just briefly about some of our thinking in the space of the role of hydrogen in industrial decarbonisation. As a quick refresher for those that are not aware, CSIRO is Australia's national science agency, a multidisciplinary applied R&D organisation, and we work collaboratively with research institutes and universities in Australia and industry participants as well around the world. We focus our work in areas of national importance where we think science and innovation can make a big difference. And you can see some of those on the screen here. Clearly, our work in sustainable energy and resources is relevant when we start to talk about hydrogen and the role it can have in decarbonising industrial systems. I think this event is focused on hydrogen, and I suspect that many people listening to this cast will have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. But just for those that are, I guess, a little bit newer to this space, and I'm wondering what all this interest is in hydrogen. It's not that new from a certain perspective. Hydrogen has been used for 100 years or more as an industrial feedstock to produce ammonia, methanol, in the refining of oil. In those scenarios, it's produced at large scale, but usually inside the plant or the factory where it's used, and that's usually made from natural gas or coal, both of which, of course, are carbon-intensive processes, and the CO2 emissions from those processes is significant. What's happened in the last few years is that there's been this real shift, and there's been a global shift in the desire for low emissions energy systems across transport, power, and industry sectors, and the realization that not every country has the renewable resources available to it to support the transition goals that they have in mind. And so what we see is this notion of hydrogen as an energy carrier, as a renewable energy carrier, and it's the opportunity to produce that in countries like Australia, where there are plentiful renewable resources, and move that to countries who do not have those resources but can use it as part of their decarbonisation plans. And so we see a real market pull globally for clean and renewable hydrogen that we've never seen before. What's also happened is that key technologies have matured to the point of commercial readiness, and as we'll start to see later on in this talk, are becoming competitive with incumbent technologies. We're also seeing advances in carriers and storage technologies, which hitherto have really been the limitation in widespread adoption of hydrogen systems. And of course, we're seeing an increasing acceptance of the use of energy alternatives across a range of sectors. And importantly, that's including governments at all levels. And so these three things have shifted over the last several years to the point where we're really now seeing a whole range of quite large-scale hydrogen projects and demonstrations around the world. And look, it's a really exciting time to be a researcher in hydrogen. Hydrogen, of course, is well suited to decarbonising transport, in particular large, long-distance transport. And of course, its use as an energy storage and power generation pathway is also quite useful. We are thinking more and more, however, about the use of hydrogen to decarbonise other sectors which have traditionally been a little bit harder to abate, whether it's because of the nature of the energy they use or whether it's because CO2 is a product rather than an energy effect. And emissions from industry are becoming more and more the target of R&D efforts and policy schemes as well. And we can see why here. this is a graph that a few of us have been talking about the last few months. This is one that Tony Wood made in a talk that he gave to the Hilt CRC recently. And this is showing clearly how our electricity emissions are projected to decrease as we reduce carbon-intensive generation and replace that with solar and wind in Australia. What we see, however, is that other emitting sectors, what's interesting for this presentation is the role of industry there, are not decreasing, and it's expected that next year sometime industry will become Australia's largest emissions source, and that's a job for people like us who do R&D to try and help different sectors transition to low carbon alternatives. Energy and mining, of course, is a space where there is lots of movement from a hydrogen perspective. That's because mainly of its reliance on quite expensive diesel, and this is especially the case in remote and areas where that diesel is trucked in and has significant CO2 emissions associated with it. And because of that, we see some of the early movement in some of the demonstrations in this space around trying to see if we can decarbonise operations. Our colleagues at Fortescue in Australia here are active in looking at hydrogen-powered light vehicles, and of course we're seeing some movement around the world in decarbonising the really large mining trucks that support so many of these operations. It's not just about transport, though, and we see that this is an example I use quite a lot. This is a Canadian example whereby we can use hydrogen in partnership with batteries and flywheels to really support quite an effective energy storage system. So this is a 30-ish megawatt microgrid in Canada at a mine. They've installed 2 3 megawatt wind turbines there and coupled that with a storage system. And that really does highlight to me how it doesn't have to be batteries or hydrogen or other. There is really a role here for different technologies to play to their strength and support energy storage over the short and medium and long term to reduce the reliance on carbon-intensive fuels. And I think when we're talking about hydrogen in industry and decarbonisation, people's minds go to steel making pretty quickly, and there's a whole bunch of angles here. I think there's the opportunity for hydrogen to be used in the beneficiation processes, which have flow-on effects to efficiency of the steel making processes. We can't decarbonise a blast furnace completely. I think the structural properties of coke are so important there. However, we can, and we've seen it in Europe in the last year or two, the use of hydrogen to partially offset some coal use. And I think that's in particular when we're looking at creating heat down the bottom of the blast furnace. And I think, given the number of blast furnaces around the world and the time frame that we expect them to be running for, by increasing the quality of the feed to those blast furnaces and partially replacing some of that coal, there's really an opportunity for quite significant emissions reduction. A lot of the visionary thinking in this space, however, is about new pathways which are much more reliant on electricity. And of course, by using a renewable electricity, that really does remove carbon from the process. They require perhaps a pre-treatment step, direct reduction step, and hydrogen has a really good role to play there because, as well as being an energy source, of course, it is a reductant. And I think there's significant opportunities for new pathways in iron and steel making, which can be potentially carbon-free. And so where does this take us from a hydrogen and from an R&D perspective? In Australia, we have a new CRC. The CRCs are cooperative research centres. They're partially funded by the federal government's CRC scheme, but have significant contributions from industry and research. And they bring together the industry and the researchers to really target big challenges. And the HILT CRC is the Heavy Industry Low Carbon Transition CRC, and its focus is very much on decarbonising some of those heavy industry sectors around iron, steel, alumina, cement, and so on. And it began last year, and we're now well and truly underway with that research program. And hydrogen integration into some of those processes forms a big part of the CRC's portfolio. And CSIRO, of course, is playing an important role there. So this is about long-term prospects for the heavy industry sector. It's about reducing the emissions from those sectors, but both by looking at where their energy comes from, but also by looking to capture the CO2 that's produced from those processes. Because in some of the processes, if we're converting calcium carbonate through to calcium oxide, for example, that CO2 emission is not due to the energy, it's part of the process. And so CO2 capture perhaps is one of the only pathways that we have available to us to decarbonise. And so I think it's, again, hydrogen is not going to be the silver bullet here. Hydrogen is part of the solution. So by using hydrogen pathways in concert with solar thermal, bioenergy, CO2 capture, and of course widespread electrification, we really do have the opportunity to decarbonise these heavy industry sectors and allow them to prosper in Australia. There is, however, plenty of work to do, and I think whenever we're talking about hydrogen and industrial applications, we think about getting the costs of that clean hydrogen down, and of course the scale of its production up. Matching the supply and the demand scenarios there is important. I think we haven't quite got the balance of that right yet, and I think as we see more and more demand side projects emerge, I think that's going to really drive the demonstration and scale up of this industry. Diversification is also important. I think we talk a lot about sector coupling when we talk about hydrogen, and that reflects the fact that we can now bring together industrial sectors such as the heavy industry sector, which I've spoken about, transport, agriculture, mining, and of course electricity in ways that we haven't had brought together before. And what that does is it supports scale, it supports widespread decarbonisation, but it does need key technologies across those value chains, and it needs organisations like CSIRO to work with our industry partners to de-risk those chains and really to demonstrate it at scale. I will leave it there. It's a little bit over 10 minutes, but I think given the virtual nature of what we're doing, that's okay. Thanks for listening. If you've got any questions or you want to have some follow-up, my contact details are there on the screen. So thanks.